From Rome to Wall Street, every empire followed patterns hidden deep inside the machinery of power. What most people never realized was that civilizations rarely collapse from the outside. They collapse when their internal systems become too complex to survive. Beneath every age of prosperity, invisible cracks were already spreading through the foundation. And throughout history, the same warning signs appeared again. Concentration of power, rising inequality. Because the real story of civilization is not how empires rise, but why they inevitably fall. Every civilization begins with the same dangerous belief, that its power is permanent. But beneath every age of dominance, systems of power were quietly becoming more fragile than they appeared. Expansion created wealth, influence, and stability, but it also planted the seeds of eventual collapse. Throughout history, prosperity often blinded societies to the dangers growing beneath their foundations. No empire collapses overnight. The process begins long before anyone are willing to see it. As civilizations grow more complex, the systems required to maintain order become increasingly difficult to control. And when economic stability begins to fracture, the illusion of permanence disappears with terrifying speed. Modern civilization may appear technologically unstoppable, but complexity itself can become the greatest vulnerability of all. What most people never notice during decline is that collapse begins psychologically before it becomes physical. And across thousands of years of history, every great civilization eventually reached the same terrifying moment. Long before modern governments and financial systems existed, civilization was built around one central idea: control. The moment humans gathered into large societies, power began concentrating into the hands of a few. Religion, law, and administration became the first invisible technologies used to organize entire populations. And as cities expanded, rulers discovered that stability depended on something far more powerful than force alone: belief. Empires survived because populations were taught to see authority as natural, inevitable, and eternal. But every new layer of organization also increased dependence on systems that could eventually fail. For the first time in history, civilizations became too large to survive without complex systems of administration. And this is where the system became dangerous, because centralized power always seeks to expand beyond its limits.
What most people never saw was the growing distance between the rulers of civilization and the populations sustaining it.
The rise of organized power transformed humanity forever, but it also created the fragile systems that every empire discovered the same seductive truth. Wealth could transform power into something that appeared unstoppable. But beneath the surface, expansion was never simply about prosperity. It was about feeding a system that could no longer stop growing. The more successful civilizations became, the more dependent they grew on continuous economic growth. The resources were consumed faster, territories expanded further, and the machine of empire demanded more with every passing generation. What looked like prosperity at the center was often built upon invisible instability spreading across the edges of civilization. And as wealth multiplied, civilizations unknowingly created systems too interconnected to fail safely. Empires often appeared of strongest moments before their foundations began to fracture. Because the larger the system became, the more catastrophic even small failures could become. What most civilizations failed to understand was that expansion creates hidden chains of dependence, impossible to see until they begin breaking apart. And throughout history, the machinery of empire always followed the same path: expansion. The most dangerous phase of every civilization is not during crisis, but during the illusion of perfect stability. Because when societies become comfortable, they stop questioning the systems holding everything together.
Prosperity has always been civilization's most effective sedative. Throughout history, collapsing empires often distracted themselves with entertainment, while the foundations beneath them weakened.
What most people never realize is that systems become truly fragile when populations stop imagining alternatives. By the time warning signs become visible, civilizations are often already deep into irreversible decline. Empires survive longest when their populations believe decline is impossible. And this is where the system becomes most vulnerable, when distraction replaces awareness. The greater the illusion of stability becomes, the more devastating the eventual disruption will be.
Because beneath every powerful civilization lies a hidden truth. Stability is often far more fragile than anyone is willing to believe. For centuries, Rome appeared invincible, the eternal empire destined to rule the world forever. But beneath the surface, the empire was already beginning to decay from within. Rome's greatest strength became its greatest weakness. Endless expansion created pressures the empire could no longer sustain.
As wealth concentrated at the top, the bond between the empire and its people slowly began to fracture. The larger Rome became, the more resources it required simply to maintain the illusion of stability. And when financial instability entered the system, confidence in the empire itself began to erode. Power became increasingly centralized, paranoid, and disconnected from the realities consuming the empire below. But Rome was not destroyed by outsiders alone. The empire had already weakened itself long before the final invasions arrived. The collapse of Rome was not a single event. It was the slow unraveling of systems that had become too fragile to survive. And this is why Rome still matters today. Because every great civilization believes it is somehow different from the ones that came before it. The most dangerous systems in civilization are often the ones nobody can fully see or fully understand.
What began as simple trade eventually evolved into systems so complex that entire civilizations became dependent on forces few people could explain.
The larger economies became, the more interconnected and vulnerable they quietly turned beneath the surface. Modern civilization depends on systems operating at speeds faster than human beings can realistically control. And throughout history, civilizations repeatedly confused artificial economic expansion with genuine stability. When highly interconnected systems begin failing, collapse no longer happens gradually. It spreads like a chain reaction.
What most people never realize is that complexity itself often becomes the hidden enemy of civilization. Because once systems become too large and interconnected, even small disruptions can spiral beyond anyone's ability to contain them.
The illusion of stability survives longest when the mechanisms of collapse remain hidden from the public.
And every great civilization eventually reaches the same terrifying moment. When the systems designed to create every civilization eventually discovers the same dangerous temptation, the ability to create money faster than real stability.
What begins as financial innovation often becomes the first invisible crack in the foundation of empire.
Debt allowed civilizations to expand beyond their natural limits, but every expansion came with a hidden cost waiting in the future.
Across thousands of years, the methods changed, but the pattern remained exactly the same. As currencies weaken, trust between civilization and its people slowly begins to disappear.
Modern financial systems are no longer isolated economies. They are deeply interconnected structures, capable of...
But by the time leaders begin reacting to financial instability, the underlying system is often already deeply fractured.
The illusion of normality survives longest during the final stages of systemic decline.
Currency collapse is never simply about money. It is the moment civilizations begin losing faith in their own future.
And throughout history, Every empire built on unsustainable debt eventually reached the same unavoidable debt.
As civilizations become more unstable, they almost always respond in the same way, by expanding control. What begins as administration slowly transforms into a machine designed to monitor entire populations.
Throughout history, leaders facing instability increasingly turn toward surveillance to maintain order.
Modern control systems no longer rely only on force. They depend on constant observation, woven invisibly into everyday life.
The more complex civilizations become, the more information they require simply to maintain stability.
And during moments of crisis, populations often surrender freedom willingly in exchange for the promise of security.
What most people never realize is that modern surveillance systems are designed not only to observe society, but to predict and shape its behavior.
The tools changed across history, but the psychology of centralized control remained remarkably similar.
The final stage of control is reached when surveillance becomes so deeply embedded that people begin monitoring themselves.
And throughout history, civilizations under pressure repeated. Every great civilization eventually develops the same dangerous addiction, endless consumption disguised as progress.
Empires expand by consuming more land, more energy, and more resources than the system can naturally replace. What appears as abundance at the center of civilization is often built upon invisible exhaustion spreading everywhere else. Modern civilization survives through systems of consumption, operating at speeds never before seen in human history. The system no longer depends only on human labor. It depends on keeping populations permanently consuming. And eventually, every civilization encounters the same terrifying reality. Resources are finite, but expansion is not.
As pressure increases, civilizations often become divided between those protecting wealth and those absorbing collapse. What civilizations leave behind often reveals more about their future than their moments of greatest success.
The cost of endless consumption is not measured only in resources. It is measured in the slow exhaustion of society itself.
And throughout history, civilizations rarely collapse because they lacked power. Every civilization eventually learns the same powerful lesson. Controlling information is often more effective than controlling armies.
Empires survive not only by shaping reality, but by shaping how people perceive reality itself.
As societies grow more unstable, information becomes increasingly weaponized to preserve order and authority. Modern populations consume more information than any civilization in history, yet often understand less about the systems controlling their lives.
Whoever controls historical memory gains extraordinary power over the future direction of society.
What most people never realize is that information systems often become deeply intertwined with economic and political power structures.
And this is where the system becomes dangerous, because divided societies become easier to control.
The more connected civilization becomes technologically, the more fragmented it can become psychologically.
For the first time in history, information itself is becoming automated at planetary scale.
And throughout history, civilizations often collapsed, not because people lacked information, but civilizations rarely collapse the moment infrastructure fails. They begin collapsing when trust between people starts to disappear. Every empire depends on invisible bonds holding society together, and once those bonds weaken, instability spreads everywhere else.
As civilizations grow more complex and unequal, populations increasingly stop seeing each other as part of the same system.
Modern societies produce extraordinary technological power, but often at the cost of emotional and social stability.
What most people never realize is that loneliness can become a systemic feature of collapsing societies. When trust in institutions begins to disappear, civilizations enter one of the most dangerous phases of decline.
The more connected civilization becomes technologically, the easier it can become emotionally disconnected from itself.
And this is where the system begins breaking apart internally, long before visible collapse arrives.
Societies often appear strongest externally during the exact moment they are weakening psychologically from within. Every great civilization depends on something far more fragile than most people ever realize: the uninterrupted movement of goods, resources, and energy.
Trade networks allowed civilizations to grow beyond local survival, but they also created dangerous dependencies stretching across entire empires.
What appears as abundance is often sustained by systems operating with almost no margin for disruption. The larger and more interconnected civilizations become, the more catastrophic supply chain failures can become. Throughout history, trade collapse has repeatedly triggered waves of instability capable of destroying entire societies.
Modern populations are deeply dependent on supply systems so complex that most people never notice them until they begin failing.
And once interconnected systems begin collapsing together, disruption spreads faster than civilizations can realistically respond.
What keeps civilization functioning is often invisible labor, hidden beneath the illusion of effortless modern life.
When supply chains break, civilizations quickly discover how thin the line between stability and chaos truly is. And throughout history, civilizations often believed their trade systems were permanent, until the day
Throughout history, civilizations approaching decline often became increasingly obsessed with war. What appeared as military ambition was often a desperate attempt to preserve unstable systems already beginning to fracture internally. Empires frequently turned outward toward conflict when they could no longer solve problems growing within their own societies. As civilizations evolve technologically, the scale and speed of warfare become increasingly catastrophic.
But modern wars no longer remain isolated battlefields. They spread through economies, information systems, and entire civilian populations. War increasingly became not only a conflict between nations, but a mechanism sustaining political and economic power itself.
Throughout history, declining empires often became more dangerous precisely because they sensed their dominance slipping away.
The next great conflicts may not begin with armies crossing borders, but with invisible systems collapsing silently from within.
And during prolonged instability, populations often accept extraordinary control measures in exchange for the promise of protection.
Because in the final stages of empire, war is rarely a sign of strength. It is often the visible symptom of a civilization. For the first time in history, nearly every major system sustaining civilization has become deeply interconnected. Efficiency created extraordinary prosperity, but it also eliminated many of the safeguards civilizations once relied upon during crisis.
What makes modern civilization powerful is also what makes it dangerously vulnerable to systemic disruption.
Human society has quietly become dependent on digital infrastructure so complex that few people fully understand how it actually functions. The illusion of stability survives because modern collapse signals are often invisible until disruption suddenly accelerates everywhere at once.
Unlike ancient empires, modern civilization no longer collapses region by region.
What keeps modern society functioning is an increasingly fragile balance, maintained by systems operating under constant pressure.
And once highly interconnected systems begin collapsing together, recovery becomes exponentially more difficult.
The architecture of modern civilization was built for endless growth and maximum efficiency, but not necessarily for survival under extreme systemic stress. Cities were once engines of innovation and trade, but eventually they grew into systems so large that maintaining equilibrium became increasingly difficult.
Modern megacities survive only through constant flows of energy, resources, and coordination, operating without interruption. As urban systems expand beyond sustainable limits, Even temporary disruptions can trigger widespread instability.
Megacities often concentrate not only wealth and innovation, but also inequality, pressure, and hidden social fragmentation.
What most people never notice is that hyperdensity can slowly erode emotional stability and social cohesion.
The larger cities become, the more civilization relies on centralized systems, vulnerable to cascading failure.
When pressure overwhelms highly concentrated urban systems, instability spreads faster than societies can realistically respond. Megacities became the ultimate symbol of human achievement, and potentially the ultimate expression of civilization stretched beyond sustainable equilibrium. For thousands of years, civilizations were built upon human labor, but for the first time in history, that foundation is beginning to change. Every technological revolution transforms society, but artificial intelligence may transform civilization itself at a scale humanity has never experienced before. Modern civilization increasingly depends on algorithms, making decisions too fast and too complex for human beings to fully understand. What once required millions of people can now increasingly be performed by machines operating without rest, emotion, or wages. As automation expands, civilizations may face not only economic disruption, but a deeper crisis of human purpose and identity.
The struggle for technological dominance may become the defining power conflict of the modern age.
Throughout history, civilizations destabilized whenever large populations lost their role inside the economic system sustaining society.
What makes artificial intelligence historically unprecedented is not simply automation.
But the more advanced civilization becomes technologically, the greater the danger that human beings themselves become psychologically disconnected from reality. Throughout history, environmental pressure has repeatedly pushed civilizations toward instability, but modern civilization may now face that pressure at planetary.
No empire in history has ever been fully separated from the environment sustaining it.
Modern civilization was built during an era of relative environmental stability, and many of its systems were never designed for prolonged disruption.
Climate stress does not operate as an isolated disaster. It multiplies pressure across every existing weakness inside civilization.
When essential resources become unstable, societies often begin fracturing faster than institutions can realistically respond.
What most people never realize is that environmental instability rapidly transforms into economic, political, and psychological instability.
Throughout history, resource pressure has repeatedly intensified conflict, migration, and the breakdown of social cohesion. Modern civilization often behaves as though endless growth remains possible, even while the systems supporting that growth begin destabilizing. The deeper instability becomes, the harder it becomes for societies to distinguish between temporary crisis and systemic decline.
Climate stress alone may not collapse civilization, but combined with economic fragility, political division, and...
For most of human history, empires were built from land, armies, and resources. But modern power
The most powerful structures shaping civilization today are often the ones ordinary people never physically see. Modern empires no longer require direct territorial occupation. They operate through information, infrastructure, and data dependency. What appears as convenience often masks systems collecting extraordinary amounts of power over society itself. For the first time in history, human civilization is increasingly influenced by systems capable of predicting and shaping collective behavior at planetary scale. The deeper societies integrate with digital systems, the more vulnerable they become to invisible forms of manipulation and control.
Digital empires increasingly rival governments in their ability to influence economies, politics, and human perception itself. The more civilization depends on invisible technological infrastructure, the greater the danger when those systems begin failing together.
What most people never realize is that modern power increasingly operates silently through data, prediction, and behavioral influence rather than visible force. And throughout history, civilizations often believed their greatest technological achievements guaranteed permanence. The human mind was never designed to process the constant pressure of modern digital civilization.
As societies became more technologically advanced, authentic human connection often weakened beneath systems.
Modern information systems are engineered to compete continuously for human attention, and attention itself has become one of civilization's most valuable resources. Many modern societies function at a psychological pace far beyond what human beings evolved to sustain.
The deeper instability spreads through civilization, the more difficult it becomes for people to psychologically process reality itself.
What appears externally as modern progress often conceals widespread emotional exhaustion beneath the surface.
The more civilization becomes individualized and digitally mediated, the greater the danger that societies lose emotional cohesion entirely. Psychological collapse rarely announces itself dramatically. It spreads quietly through exhaustion, alienation, and the gradual erosion of meaning.
And throughout history, civilizations often focused on maintaining economic and technological systems, while
Modern civilization was built upon one central assumption: that economic growth could continue forever.
Throughout history, every great empire expanded by extracting more wealth, more labor, and more resources than the system could sustainably maintain. What often appears as economic strength during the late stages of empire is frequently built upon unsustainable foundations hidden beneath the surface. Modern economies no longer simply support civilization. Civilization itself has become dependent on maintaining continuous financial expansion. As wealth concentrates into fewer hands, the gap between economic appearance and social reality grows increasingly unstable. Highly interconnected financial systems create extraordinary prosperity during stability, but catastrophic vulnerability during disruption. The technologies evolved across history, but the underlying pattern of unsustainable expansion remained remarkably similar. And once confidence in the economic system begins breaking down, recovery becomes increasingly difficult because modern economies depend fundamentally on belief. What most people never realize is that civilizations often appear economically strongest immediately before entering periods of irreversible decline.
Institutions survive only as long as populations believe the system still works for them.
As pressure increases across civilization, institutions often become slower, more rigid, and increasingly When populations stop trusting political, financial, and social institutions, fragmentation begins accelerating through every layer of civilization.
The collapse of institutional legitimacy often begins long before physical collapse becomes visible. What keeps civilizations stable is often not the strength of institutions themselves, but collective confidence that they remain functional.
As trust disappears, societies increasingly lose the shared reality required for large-scale cooperation and stability.
Throughout history, institutions often maintained the appearance of order long after they internally recognized growing instability.
The illusion of institutional strength can survive surprisingly long, until one major shock exposes how fragile the system has truly become.
And once civilizations begin losing trust in their institutions, decline no longer remains only economic.
Every civilization eventually reaches a moment when pressure accumulates faster than the system can absorb.
The tipping point rarely arrives as one single event. It emerges when multiple crises begin colliding together at once.
Throughout history, civilizations often appeared stable right until the exact moment their interconnected systems began failing simultaneously.
By the time leaders fully recognize systemic collapse, the underlying pressures are often already beyond realistic control.
What makes tipping points so dangerous is how quickly normal life can begin unraveling once public confidence disappears. Modern civilization is so deeply interconnected that disruption in one critical system can rapidly destabilize everything connected to it.
The tipping point of civilization is reached when institutions can no longer stabilize the pressure overwhelming society.
Collapse becomes psychologically devastating because people struggle to accept that systems once considered permanent can suddenly become fragile.
And once cascading failures begin accelerating across highly complex societies, recovery becomes exponentially more difficult with every passing hour. The tipping point. The tipping point is not the beginning of collapse. It is the moment civilization finally realizes the system was already.
In the final stages of empire, societies often begin emotionally unraveling before they fully collapse physically.
One of the most consistent patterns throughout history is that civilizations rarely recognize their own decline while it is happening.
As pressure increases, populations often turn against each other instead of confronting the deeper systems driving instability.
The final phase of empire psychology is often defined by denial at the top and emotional exhaustion throughout the population.
When societies lose shared purpose and collective trust, fragmentation accelerates faster than institutions can repair it. Throughout history, declining empires increasingly relied on force, surveillance, and distraction to preserve the appearance of control. One of the strangest characteristics of collapsing civilizations is how ordinary life often continues even while the foundations beneath society begin disintegrating. The more unstable civilization becomes, the more emotionally reactive and psychologically polarized society often turns.
Collapse becomes most terrifying when people finally understand that the systems protecting them may never fully recover.
And in the final phase of empire psychology, the greatest danger is not only collapse itself, but the realization after every great collapse in history, humanity faced the same question: what kind of civilization comes next? Civilization has never remained static. It constantly transforms through crisis, adaptation, and survival. The future may depend on whether humanity learns to build systems focused on resilience instead of endless expansion. Every empire once believed its systems represented the final stage of progress, until history proved otherwise. What happens after collapse may ultimately depend on whether societies continue competing for power or begin cooperating for survival.
The civilizations that survive the future may not be the most powerful, but the most adaptable.
History becomes valuable only when civilizations are willing to learn from the systems that destroyed those before them.
The farther civilization expands technologically, the more essential balance and sustainability may become for long-term survival. The future of civilization may depend not only on technological advancement, but on rediscovering what makes societies emotionally stable in the first place. The future civilization question is not whether humanity can survive collapse, but whether it can finally break the cycle that destroyed every empire before it. In the end, every civilization leaves behind the same question: what remains after the systems disappear?
History remembers even the greatest empires as fragments scattered across time.
Collapse does not necessarily mean the end of humanity, but it often marks the end of one way of living.
The civilizations that come after us may study our world the same way we study the ruins of ancient empires.
Long after political systems, currencies, and institutions disappear, the planet itself continues adapting without them.
Perhaps the greatest value of collapse is the knowledge it leaves behind for those willing to listen.
The civilizations that endure may not be the ones that grow the fastest, but the ones that understand their limits.
Even after collapse, traces of humanity's ambitions may continue echoing through the systems we leave behind. What comes after collapse is shaped by whether humanity chooses to repeat the same patterns or finally evolve beyond them. Because the final lesson shared by every great civilization is this: no empire lasts forever.